Welcome back. All of the TV stations in the Gray Media family, including Northern News Now, are taking part in a monthly series of stories called We the People. They aim to celebrate our nation's 250th birthday with stories of events and people who have played a big part in America's history. February's story is about Richard Bong and the airplanes he flew that were named after his wife.
Northern Wisconsin is the home of Richard Ira Bong, America's ace of aces, who in World War II flew several P-38 fighter planes. This P-38, painstakingly restored by technicians from the 148th Fighter Wing for the Richard Bong Museum, is not really the ace of aces plane. It's a war surplus Lightning the government gave to Poplar, Wisconsin in 1948 to honor America's greatest Top Gun. Major Bong flew two different P-38s named after his fiancée, Marge Vattendahl of Superior. He did his fighting over Papua New Guinea, a remote Pacific island whose jungles are still littered with World War II wreckage today.
And because of that, they are full of history. Crash sites, battlefields, airfields from the war.
In 2024, Justin Talon of Pacific Rex found Bong's first Marge, which had crashed in the Papua New Guinea jungle after suffering from mechanical failure. Marge number 2 was lost in Manila Bay, Philippines after a similar failure.
The Fate, during 1945, took off piloted by an unknown pilot on a checkout flight. During the test flight, the engine caught fire and the pilot bailed out and landed safely.
During a war bond tour on the home front, Major Bong flew a third P-38 whose fate has been lost to time. The Marge replica was towed from the 148th by Jeff Foster Trucking and now sits at a place of honor at the museum named after Poplar's native son. Since the discovery of Marge number 1's wreckage, the people of New Guinea have taken notice of Richard Bong's role in history. One village, for example, is really taking Major Bong to heart.
The village that is closest to the crash site plans on naming their school the Richard Bong Village School.
Celebrating 250 years in Superior, Wisconsin, I'm Dave Anderson for We the People.
Major Richard I. Bong was killed in the closing days of World War II when the jet fighter he was test flying crashed. He was laid to rest in his hometown of Poplar. His spouse Marge passed away in Superior in 2003.